You tell yourself you're done. You see the red flags. You remember the nights you cried, the quiet erosion of your self-worth, and yet something inside leads you back, not always to the same person, but often to the same pattern. A familiar kind of ache wrapped in a different name. We like to think we've outgrown the hurt, that we've learned our lesson, but healing isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. And every time we think we're past it, life asks us once more, have you truly understood why you keep choosing what breaks you? This isn't about weakness or foolishness. It's about recognition, about how the human mind left unchecked often seeks comfort not in joy, but in what's known. And sometimes, the only love we've learned is the kind that hurts. In this video, we're going to explore the quiet mechanics behind emotional repetition. We'll look at how the earliest wounds shape the deepest choices, how familiarity can masquerade as fate, and what it really takes to choose differently, not just once, but over and over again. Because until we name the pattern, we remain inside it. Before we can break the cycle, we have to see it. That means stepping back, not just from the people who've hurt us, but from the stories we've been taught to believe about love, pain, and ourselves. Let's begin by looking at the pattern from the outside. What does it actually look like? And why is it so easy to fall into again and again? It always starts quietly. A small gesture that feels oddly familiar. A tone of voice. A way they look at you when you're speaking. Something unnameable that draws you in, not with force, but with recognition. And even though you might not consciously realize it at first, your body does. Your nervous system leans in, feeling like it already knows how to dance with this person, how to shape itself around their presence. At first, it feels exciting. There's a thrill in how quickly the connection builds. You tell yourself, this time it's different. But with time, the cracks appear, small disappointments, a disregard for your boundaries, subtle manipulations, emotional withdrawals, and though a part of you knows this script too well, another part whispers, maybe this is just what love feels like. That's the pattern, not just choosing the wrong person, but choosing a familiar dynamic, one rooted in an emotional blueprint you never consciously created. And because it doesn't show up in neon lights, because it cloaks itself in romance, in intensity, even in longing, it's easy to miss until you're already entangled. The hardest part isn't leaving the relationship. The hardest part is recognizing that you've seen this movie before, that you've played this role, that even when the names and faces change, something deep inside is still hoping for a different ending from the same story. What we often call chemistry is sometimes just trauma trying to find its way home. It's not always love at first sight. It might be survival, disguised as destiny. And yet, when this pattern shows up, we don't judge ourselves. Instead, we ask a gentler question. What part of me thinks this is what I deserve? Because that's where healing begins, not with blame, but with curiosity. To understand why we gravitate toward these patterns, we need to go back, not to the last relationship, but much further. Because long before we ever dated anyone, we learned something about love. Often, those early lessons came not from what we were told, but from what we felt, what we lacked, what we had to survive. Let's explore the emotional imprints that shaped our choices before we even knew we were choosing. Long before we fell in love for the first time, we were already learning what love felt like. Not through words, but through silence. Through the look in a caregiver's eyes when we reached for comfort. Through the tone they used when we cried. Through the moments we felt invisible, or too much, or only conditionally accepted. These early experiences form what psychologists call emotional imprints, unconscious blueprints that guide how we interpret closeness, safety, and connection. Imagine a child growing up in a home where affection came with anxiety, or where warmth was inconsistent, here one day, gone the next. That child learns to equate love with uncertainty, with working hard for scraps of approval. And though the child grows up, the nervous system remembers. It searches for what's familiar, not what's healthy. That's why someone who treats you with steady kindness might feel boring at first, because they don't fit the imprint. Your system isn't used to calm, it's used to chasing. And so, when someone triggers that early emotional map, when they give just enough and then pull away, you feel alive. But it's not love, it's survival. These wounds don't always come from trauma in the traditional sense. Sometimes, it's the quiet absence of what should have been there. Validation, safety, emotional attunement. And without even knowing it, you begin to reenact that original search in adulthood. You look for people who feel like home, but home was never peaceful to begin with. Here's the hardest part. Many of these patterns operate completely below the surface. You're not consciously choosing pain, you're responding to a script written years ago, often before you had words. But that doesn't mean you're doomed to repeat it. It means you need to learn the language of your own imprint, and slowly, patiently, begin to rewrite it. When we start to understand our emotional imprints, something begins to shift. But awareness alone isn't always enough to stop the cycle. Because even when we know it's hurting us, the pull of the familiar can be stronger than the promise of something new. So why does the brain keep leading us back into what we've already outgrown? To answer that, we have to look at how deeply comfort and survival are wired into our emotional decisions. The human brain is designed for efficiency, not happiness. It doesn't ask what's good for you, it asks, what have we survived before? And whatever the answer is, it starts to carve pathways around that experience, reinforcing it until it becomes second nature. This is why, even when a relationship is painful, part of you feels drawn to it. Because your nervous system isn't searching for peace, it's searching for something it knows how to navigate. That familiarity, no matter how damaging, brings a strange kind of comfort. It's not pleasure, it's predictability. Neuroscientists call this repetition compulsion, a phenomenon where we unconsciously recreate early emotional dynamics in an attempt to master them. It's the psyche's way of saying, maybe this time, I can make it right. But in reality, we're not healing the past, we're reliving it. There's a moment many people experience in therapy or self-reflection when they realize, it's not that I only attract toxic people, it's that I'm drawn to them. Not because you want to be hurt, but because your brain equates that chaos with love. That moment of recognition can be devastating, but it can also be the beginning of freedom. Addiction to familiarity isn't a failure of willpower, it's a survival mechanism. And the more chaotic your early emotional environment was, the more likely your nervous system is to confuse intensity with intimacy. A long pause in a text conversation feels like abandonment. A calm disagreement feels like distance. Emotional safety feels foreign, maybe even suspicious. But here's the truth. Healing means learning to sit with discomfort, not just from pain, but from peace. It means understanding that sometimes the most emotionally stable people might initially feel wrong, not because they are, but because your system hasn't learned to recognize them as safe. That's the quiet work of healing, teaching your body, over time, that love doesn't have to feel like a fight. Realizing that we're drawn to what's familiar, not what's good for us, can feel disorienting, but it's also empowering. Because once we see the pattern, we can begin to disrupt it. And sometimes, that disruption starts with the smallest, most human moment, the quiet realization that something doesn't feel right anymore. That we're ready for a different kind of love, even if we don't fully know what it looks like yet. There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when something inside begins to stir. It often doesn't come with fireworks or a grand revelation. Instead, it arrives as a subtle discomfort, like a soft but persistent whisper that says, "This doesn't feel right anymore." You might still be in the relationship, still smiling, still rationalizing, but the story no longer fits. The excuses feel thinner. The high you used to chase doesn't quite land the same way. And underneath it all, a deeper truth begins to emerge, not fully formed, but undeniable. These are the early moments of awakening, and they're often marked not by clarity, but by confusion. You start to notice how drained you feel after conversations, how often you second-guess yourself, how your needs have been slowly pushed to the margins. You may not know exactly what's wrong, but you feel the ache of misalignment. Awakening isn't dramatic, it's subtle, often lonely. It's sitting in your car a little longer before going inside. It's rereading old messages and seeing them differently. It's the quiet realization that love should not feel like walking on eggshells. And with that realization comes grief, not just for the relationship, but for the part of you that accepted so little for so long. You begin to mourn the years spent convincing yourself that this was enough, that if you just loved harder, stayed quieter, became smaller, it might work. But there's beauty in that grief, because it means you're waking up. You're no longer asleep inside the old narrative. You're beginning to see the contours of a different life, one that doesn't require self-abandonment. In these moments, you may not feel strong. You may feel raw, unsure, and unsteady. But make no mistake, this is strength. To feel the pull of the old and still pause. To sit with discomfort instead of rushing back to what's familiar. That is how transformation begins, not with certainty, but with pause. Awareness is a doorway, but healing is the walk through. Once we've seen the pattern, once we've felt the pain of staying asleep, the question becomes, what now? What does it actually look like to choose differently, day after day, when everything inside you wants to go back to what you've always known? In the final section, we'll explore the slow, steady work of change and the small, quiet acts that carry us forward. Healing isn't loud. It doesn't always look like leaving or starting over or making declarations to the world. Often, it begins in the smallest choices, those quiet, internal moments when you notice the pull of an old pattern and gently choose something different. You pause before replying to that message that once would have pulled you back. You speak up, even when your voice trembles. You sit with the loneliness, instead of running to a familiar chaos just to fill the silence. These moments may feel insignificant, but they are the architecture of change. They are the places where you build a new story, not overnight, but brick by brick. Healing asks you to become your own safe place, to offer yourself the consistency you once begged from others. It asks for patience, for forgiveness, for presence. There will be days you slip back, days the old life feels easier. But those moments don't erase your progress. They reveal your humanity. You don't have to be perfect to be healing. You just have to keep choosing, again and again, not to abandon yourself. And eventually, the unfamiliar becomes the new familiar. Peace stops feeling boring. Kindness feels trustworthy. You recognize red flags faster, and you no longer confuse intensity with love. That's not the end of the journey, but it is a beginning worth honoring. If any part of this felt like your story, if you've ever found yourself stuck in a pattern you couldn't quite name, know that you're not alone. Healing is messy, quiet, and rarely linear, but it's possible, and it's worth it. If you're walking this path, I'd love for you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel, and if you want to know when new videos arrive, tap the bell. That way, you won't miss the next chapter of this ongoing conversation. And if you feel safe to share, tell me below, what part of the pattern are you learning to release? I'll be reading and rooting for you.